Hi there. Okay, so we're going to delve right into the nervous system. We have the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spine. The skull is included when we say brain. Um, so, um, the central nervous system is protected by three things: the skull, meninges, and cerebrospinal fluid. Um, so with the meninges, we have the dura mater, the arachnoid space, the arachnoid membrane, and the pia mater. Okay, and so there's that, and then we have cerebrospinal fluid, which circulates around the subarachnoid space, which is right under the arachnoid membrane, and right on top of the pia mater. And it's produced by choroid plexus from blood plasma. It cushions the brain. It's like a cushion. It's clear. It has a high concentration of salts. It gets rid of excess neurotransmitter, which is considered a waste in the brain. And then, so since it's continuously being produced, it needs to be continuously absorbed, because you don't want to have too much cerebrospinal fluid, otherwise your head blows up, which is considered hydrocephalus. And so excess cerebrospinal fluid is continuously absorbed into dural sinuses, which run through the dura mater and then through the jugular veins of the neck. They're blood-filled spaces. So to fix hydrocephalus, which would be if there's a blockage and the cerebrospinal fluid isn't draining out of you, which usually happens because a tumor is pushing against the wall of the brain, then you insert a tube or a shunt and you drain the fluid from the blocked ventricle into a vein. And then just along with that, we have meningitis and encephalitis. Meningitis is an inflammation or infection of the meninges, the lining of the brain, and the cerebrospinal fluid between them. So we have the dura mater, the arachnoid membrane, the pia mater, and the cerebrospinal fluid. All of that gets infected. Okay, and then encephalitis is an infection and an inflammation of the brain itself. Okay, we're going to move on to the peripheral nervous system, which is pretty extensive. So I'll go into it in general, definitive terms. The autonomic nervous system, I don't like that. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system it regulates the body's internal environment. So there are sympathetic nerves, and there are parasympathetic nerves. Sympathetic nerves, you can think like when you're sympathetic, you're aroused. So they deal with neurotransmitters such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are adrenaline, as we discussed in the previous video. So they attempt to mobilize and stimulate energy. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the contrary, tries to conserve energy. So you can think parasympathetic, you can think paralyze, and you can think acetylcholine, because acetylcholine tries to relax you, or it contracts your muscles. Then you can think, so let's just go over that one more time. The sympathetic nervous system has sympathetic nerves, which stimulate, organize, and mobilize energy resources in threatening situations, fight or flight. And then there is the somatic nervous system, which regulates the external environment. I think somatic, external environment. And there are afferent nerves and efferent nerves. The afferent nerves go from the body to the central nervous system, and then the efferent nerves go from the central nervous system to the body. Most nerves project from the spine, but there are cranial nerves. Think cranium. They project from the brain, and there's 12 pairs, and they're all sensory, and they're associated with the sensory nervous system. And then something just you should know is dermatome is the skin connected to a particular spinal nerve. So that is what we have there. Now, we're going to go back to, we're going to start discussing the central nervous system again. So we discussed the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid, but there's much more to it. So the size of one's brain, interestingly enough, does not determine really ability. The size of a particular brain region just indicates the importance that that region is for survival for an animal. So rats, olfactory bulbs, raccoons, somatosensation and digit representation, dolphins and bats, echolocation regions, and then gorillas and humans, visual centers, because we prey typically. So that's not what I'm looking for. Okay. So in humans, there are divisions of the brain. We have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Okay, so the forebrain is the telencephalon, the diencephalon. The midbrain is the mesencephalon, and the hindbrain is the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. And so there are lots of structures within those three divisions. The forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and then each subdivision. So the forebrain deals with the limbic system. The limbic system handles the 4 F's: fleeing, feeding, fighting, and fucking. Now, something that you need to know is that it's a subcortical structure. So, anyways, it holds the amygdala, which is also part of the basal ganglia, another subcortical structure. But the amygdala regulates aggression, fear, and anxiety. And if it's impaired, you can act out weird sexually or have fits of rage. The hippocampus deals with learning and memory. And the medial prefrontal cortex deals with social behavior and regulating that. And an example of how that can go, how important that is Phineas Gage was a railroad dude, and something went right through his a metal bar went right through his prefrontal cortex, and socially he just was inept after that. So the forebrain has the limbic system. The cerebrum, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, which is the limbic system actually just surrounds the thalamus. And the thalamus deals with heat, cold, pain, pressure. Okay? The cerebral cortex, that's the main part of the let's see, we have a whole thing on. That's the main part of the forebrain, and in this we have fissures. Okay, so it's furrowed, so that it can take up more space without making the brain bigger. And then so fissures are the furrows, and then sulci are the small furrows, and then gyri are the ridges in between that. So the cerebral cortex, that tissue that is furrowed, is divided into lobes. The frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the temporal lobes, and the occipital lobes. Now, before we do that, let's just establish the cortical areas of the cerebral cortex. We have the prefrontal cortex, which deals with planning, problem solving, planning, emotion. The primary motor cortex, voluntary movement. Primary sensory cortex, info from body. Visual cortex, stimulating, processing complex visual stimuli. And then the auditory cortex, processing complex auditory stimuli. The frontal lobes handle the prefrontal cortex. The frontal lobes are in the prefrontal cortex. They deal with planning and emotion. Parietal lobes, senses and taste. That'll be in the sensory cortex. Temporal lobes, learning, memory, hearing. So that would be in the auditory cortex. And then occipital lobes, which deals with vision. And that's going to obviously be in the visual cortex. Now, damage to your lobes can be pretty serious. If there's damage to your frontal lobes, which are part of your prefrontal cortex, dealing with planning and emotion, you won't be able to make plans. You'll become passive and just weird socially. Then we have parietal lobes, which are sense and taste, dealing with the sensory cortex, and you'll have a hard time recognizing touch and pain. Then temporal lobes, if they're damaged, you won't be able to recognize people, you'll lose your memory. Temporal lobe, learning, memory, hearing, auditory cortex. And then the occipital lobes, visual cortex, you just might not be able to see. So, that's the forebrain for you. Let's see if we can just wrap this up here. So the cerebral cortex, just to finish, is the youngest part of the nervous system. It's bordered by the limbic system. It sensory, voluntary movement, complex cognitive processes, all of which were discussed in the cortical structures of the cerebral cortex, which is in the telencephalon. So frontal lobes, planning, parietal lobes, sensory, temporal lobes, memory, hearing, occipital lobes, vision. That's all in the cerebral cortex. So great.